Welcome to this seminar called Kittybox, my rude name for addressing the meaning, presence, possibilities of so-called sandbox play. I'm willing to be corrected about this, but I think the name is actually pretty recent. I haven't encountered it in any of my long-term experience with role-playing in all the various adventures and modules and scenarios and town packs and who knows what. But for all I know, it was in use here and there. I just don't know. I do know that it seems to have come into role-playing terminology as sort of an everybody knows what this is term. I would say 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more at the earliest. That's when I started to encounter it. So what I want to do here is to investigate some published materials. My goal is to look and see whether this term is diverse rather than centralized. And we'll start simply by saying, what's your understanding? And maybe sandbox isn't, I don't want to be limited to the term precisely, but rather what's your characterization of play to which you think that term may fairly be applied.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
So, either one, either person.
Well, I mean, my thought of what a sandbox means is that you have an essential map of a world or a region, and that there are little plot elements hidden throughout at each location. So if you go here, you'll encounter this person, this problem, this guy. Come down here, you'll have problem these people, so that the story is made up by where you go as opposed to anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That's mine.
For me, the way I've understood it is the idea that the environment in which the players go around with the characters, it starts as a snapshot of a world that is frozen just before the players get into it, and when the players start going around it, the world starts moving. And also the idea that to create the feeling or to reproduce it to some degree, that the world continues to exist while the players are not there. Like if the players don't interact with a faction or like a kingdom or whatever for a while, that kingdom doesn't stop being there. It does things, it evolves, goes to war or whatever.
Right. The interesting thing that you guys have brought up is the distinction between mobility in terms of distance and time, fictional time. Because in the one case, we're talking about freedom of movement of the player characters, where they go and from what angle they may enter a particular situation. It may matter whether they come from the east or come from the west. And then there's also the issue of time, the idea that time is applying to everybody and everything in this scenario or in this designated area. So now I am going to claim that the use of the term is often not as rigorous as to include both of those. And one of the things that's a little bit left out of this, which gets confounded, and I can actually point to a couple of old threads where this was a matter of some temper, to the point that a person showed up 4 years later at Gen Con still mad. And thought that I was going to pick up the conversation right where it left off, as if I, had been stewing over it equally for the intervening period.
Let alone remember.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
I know. It's like, okay. But the point is, what about purposes of play? What about playing on purpose? The way that I refer to that term. Is this kind of play related to stepping on up, in a terms of this is challenging me as a player. This is testing my resolve, testing my strategy, testing my skills. Or is this lending itself well to highly emergent story that could not have been pre-scripted, for example. So often when I'm talking about these issues and somebody might say, oh, I see, you're talking about sandbox play, I kind of have to blink and say, well, I'm not sure if you are, if you aren't, or if I am or if I'm not. So I'm just tossing in purpose of play as another variable that is going to make it difficult in terms of definition, because that gets brought in. So what have we brought? I have mentioned already that I've brought 3 things. One of them is a famous known adventure module from the early 1980s called The Secret of Bone Hill. And it's part of a specific series of Dungeons and Dragons modules that's intended for low-level players. Yes,
I just picked that. I just picked that module because I'm supposed to run an AD&D game at some point soon because of a dare I did.
Really?
And I had to run it. Yes. Yeah. And that was one of the.
Well, may this be useful to you then.
Yeah, maybe it will.
All right. And so the other one that I've brought is from almost exactly the same period. It's a different module series, and it's called Against the Cult of the Reptile God, which, with the exception of the Village of Hamlet, ranks easily in the top few favorite Advanced Dungeons and Dragons modules. And I played it extensively in the early 80s. And interestingly enough, 20 years later, I played it extensively using elves. So, yeah. So the
on that note, I just want to show you what I received in the mail today.
Oh, look at that!
Oh, yes,
nice.
I found it on eBay.
Well, I appreciate somebody selling it and somebody buying it. That's fantastic. I am fond of that little beast. It is stronger than most people realize.
I'm excited to read it.
All right, so the third thing I brought is called The Haunted Highlands, and it's from the Castles and Crusades game. It was published 20 years later in the actually I think this is from about the mid-late 2000s. So around 2008. So those are what I have, and as you can see, they're all kind of D&D-ish.
Well, you're saying those adventures made me wonder, would something like Masks of Nyarlathotep, not that I'm good at saying words, or Mystery of the Orient Express, those sort of long-term Call of Cthulhu adventures, would you consider those sandboxy, or are they too directed?
Right. If I'm going by my understanding of the Mask of Nyarlathotep in particular, it's brutally linear.
Yeah. You pretty much, no, I mean, you can go from country to country in different orders.
In that case, so that's the question. So let's take a look and see if that's really the only variable that matters. Don't forget, we're starting with a historical precedent. The historical precedent was, and the term was, to run through the dungeon like a gauntlet. And whether you went in and strategized so that then you came out that way, because that was the way you knew or had mapped to get back out, or whether there was some other exit that you either found accidentally or you knew about and you were trying to go through literally, doesn't really matter. The point is that you're in, and even if you have left, right on your own, you really just have one destination, which is out.
Right, of course.
And this is often referred to as A to B play. It really is just get in there and somehow get out. And it's usually presented as kind of the contrast to sandbox. The notion that you have, some sort. I think a big part of the picture that I'm trying to paint or perceiving that I think I'm perceiving is the idea that the players have time to rest. They can regroup. They can get kind of back to baseline. They can look around. And to do it in the fiction, unlike Tunnels and Trolls, where you get out of the dungeon and then you do all of your bookkeeping and buy new spells and things. Right. Yeah. But and all sorts of things sort of imply that the characters are doing something involving real life. But you don't play it. Town is just town. Town is when you're not playing. Right. And so it's getting away from that. It's the idea that you keep playing while this regrouping process is going on. And so therefore you have places on the map which are, for lack of a better word, okay, or even home.
Interesting.
So that's a piece of the puzzle as well. The tricky thing that I'm going to try to illustrate with the secret of Bone Hill is that it is a town map, Restonford. Bone Hill is just like a place in the immediate environment, the immediate region. And it is Restonford and let's see, I even have it quoted here. See what you can make of this. Restonford is meant to be a safe harbor and or base of operations for a party. This does not mean that adventure there is impossible. Far from it. However, as DM, you should try to make this purpose clear without having to blurt it out in as many words. Okay, I think you can see that these 3 sentences are very hard actually to put together. If it's a safe harbor and base of operations, then how do you have adventures there? And how does that relate to how safe it is? I mean, I understand that maybe it's okay to have adventures in your safe harbor once in a while, but is there a means for that? How do you know it? I mean, how do those relate exactly, first of all? Right. Second, what on earth is that third sentence? I mean, how am I supposed to let them know it's the base of operations? Like hand signals? You know? So it's, anyway,
it's like make your move.
First of all, without making fun of the prose, I want to emphasize that you'll find, Angel, that kind of talk is common throughout the whole module. The double talk. What on earth is this for? And I think, and that's why the purpose of play, comes to mind. So structurally, what's interesting, and I'll just say it flat out, the entire region of Restonford is one big dungeon. With little areas. I mean, it's open air, it's above ground, right? Fine, the people live there in the village, in the town. You walk down and buy a pack of cigarettes or something, kidding. But whatever. And then, but the idea is it's all set up for, it's as if there were safe rooms in a dungeon that you had established as safe. That if you get back to it, you're okay for a while. And then you decide like which ones to foray out among as you go. And so because it breaks down like this. First of all, there are several pockets in and around the town which are, for lack of a better word, infested. One of them is a ruined guard tower full of some undead. One of them is Pebble Hill has like a band of orc thieves, and there's a couple of other things like that scattered around where if you go there, they're waiting to be killed. Second, the title, Bone Hill, is one of those. It's a complicated one of those, but not very complicated. We're assured that the 2 bad guys there are up to no good and are evil. They're full of evil purposes. They've got a band of, bugbears. They've got a band of weird undead, like some customized undead. But they just float there until you go there. And then you have the percentages of which one you'll encounter, whether it's day or night. But there's nothing about what they do if you don't go there. Nothing. Same thing with the others. So unlike what you were talking about, Angel, these little pockets of things to kill sort of float there until
like
you arrive. Yeah. And so there's like that. Yeah, go ahead.
This seems to me like there's that what you said about the time
Right.
focus point and the space focus point are like two different interpretations of the sandbox idea that are are like pretty different. Like some games or go for one and some others are more for
Yeah.
the other.
Right. This one is very strongly on the distance and the options of where you go, but has no time component whatsoever. And the other interesting thing is that there are a couple of resources that also just float there. One of them is a place where apparently a bunch of mercenaries hang out and have a picnic until you show up and decide which one you're going to hire. And then the other one is I'm being really mean, actually. I mean, this is a loved module. I've owned it for all these years. I shouldn't be doing this, but I have to admit I did try to use it as a kid, and perhaps I'm scarred. Then also another one is this forest, which has a temple in it, which worships some kind of random god. So you go in and you can bargain your things with like a roulette. There's even a system in there for what you can get. So it's kind of a way that you can risk what you have and maybe get a really cool magic item.
Yeah, like a little mini game.
Right. Now, what tells you about this is that it is very much so. You'll see on how when you check it out. The other interesting thing about this is that there's a really the most developed thing about the module is the rumors and information.
That's
things,
cool.
Every single place has a thing to roll on for what someone will tell you. And it all refers to some other thing. So the idea is that you're mapping it, not by drawing a map. You can just look at the map. But you're mapping it as a dungeon by this rumor method.
Nice.
Right. And so that's the idea. So the point is when you're not running around causing trouble, then your characters are basically safe. If you go somewhere, you can go there for resources, you can go there for a fight. What fight do you want that you've heard about, perhaps?
Right.
And then there's also the very elaborate map of the Baron's fortress. What's weird is that it's brutally detailed in terms of which character you might run into at day or night, by percent, by room. But you're not really allowed to go in. Every single time it talks about one of the characters, it says, wait till module 2, wait till module 2, wait till module 2. There's even a sorcerer in a tower in Restenverd who is really important in module 2. Oh, and the chief cleric of the local church is bonkers, but all of that is in module 2. In this one, it basically tells you they're there and says, don't go, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch. Even up to the point of having the full dungeon in the fortress completely detailed, including like a wish spell waiting for you. But don't touch, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch.
That's so weird that they
It's
give you
really
that
mysterious.
information.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Well,
Like,
remember,
here's
a
the-
lot of these things grew out of tournament play.
Right.
And in this case, RGPA session play, like where you sit down for 12 hours and play.
Right.
With a dedicated DM whose job is to make damn sure that you're entertained. And so a lot of this may have been used very differently in that circumstance than it is for this massage into a publication.
See what you're saying.
So these all have complicated histories. All of these modules have complicated histories. Very few were just sitting down and written. That comes much later. So but the idea is that Bonehill, therefore, really operates like a dungeon with some safe spaces that you can use to regroup. And if you play it that way, I think it would be very satisfying. If you try to play it as a town to interact with, it's all barriers. There's not a single townsperson with a single interesting thing to say or do.
Right.
There's
just
no drama.
free-floating rumors.
Right, just free-floating rumors about whom you might go and go fight.
Right.
There's nothing political going on in the town. There's nothing cultural happening in the town.
Is there an exit? By which I mean, is there a culmination at some point? Well, I mean, maybe you need module
not in
2 or
right,
module
not in the
3
secret
for
of Bonehill. There isn't. It's in the title implies that it might be fighting that one particular bad group. But really, if you
Right.
look at them relative to all the others, they're completely meaningless. They're just as important as any of the other free-floating
Right.
sit-around bad guys. They don't have any role that's special to the history of the town. Nothing.
And how many modules are there in the series?
There's actually 3,
Yeah.
if I recall correctly. There may be 4. I have them all. They are very, very, very different, and interestingly enough, they get you the hell out of Restonford.
I missed that last
They
part.
get you out of Restonford.
They do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
you
no.
mean for the whole adventures, you're out of
Yes,
rest.
you don't stay in Restonford for the rest of the modules.
That's
It's not
surprising.
like the Restonford series.
Right.
So that's a little strange too.
That is. It's unexpected.
In the second one, the Baron is killed and the cleric is crazy, and that one is an absolutely linear story driving thing. And you see, this is the important point. If I get it correctly, the implication of sandbox in modern terms is no railroading. Do you hear me? No railroading. Nobody's telling you what to do.
Yeah.
You'll notice, however, that in this circumstance, nothing happens. I mean, if you don't treat it as a dungeon, then nothing can happen. Even if you do.
Yeah, it's like you can do anything, but it doesn't mean anything.
Right, nothing will happen. You'll see check it out when you read it and see if you agree on how maybe I'm wrong.
Mm.
But there's no responsivity built into any other part of that town.
Mm.
Reptile God is totally different. Okay, just to let you know. It's totally different. So what do you see with Stars Without Number? Did you generate the random thing?
Oh yeah. So yeah, the game I wrote is Start With a Number, first edition. There's like a expanded or second edition that came out recently, which I don't have or read. So I'm going to go with this one.
Read the back again.
And yeah, there's. Oh yeah. So the important part is Start With a Number offers GMs and players the tools to create their own sandbox-style adventures in the far future. So in Start With a Number, there's several procedures to generate basically first what they call the sector, which is like a section of the universe in which the players go around. The idea is that there was the Earth in the past. People spread out from there. They were able to communicate. They went into the galaxies, and then something happened, like a cataclysm or something, and they got split. And now people are only able to communicate and travel within their own sector, and that sector is where the play is essentially the sandbox for the adventure. And the game has procedures to procedurally generate that sector. Basically, you have a grid of boxes and each one like through rolls and tables and that kind of stuff. You populate it with planets, and some of them have intelligent life. Some of them are like frozen. Some of them are like balls of, I don't know, fire, whatever. Like you have like a few different details for each planet. Like,
can I ask here? What you're describing goes all the way back to Traveller in the 70s and has been kind of a staple of space games for a long time. But in and of itself, it doesn't tell us anything about play, because I don't care if you generated it yourself through a million tables or picked it up in a source pack. The end result's going to look the same. So,
yeah, right. So this is first step.
Right.
I guess the sandbox stuff comes later. Once you have that, there's the concept of factions. Factions are like different factions in play. It could be like a company, pirate, fleet, an empire, whatever. And each faction has like a set of stats to kind of represent how powerful they are, how aggressive they can be, how much wealth they have, that kind of stuff. And between sessions, the GN has a faction turn, which basically consists in going faction by faction, deciding, okay, these factions wants to do this thing this turn, and they have like a available number of available actions they can do, and it's limited,
Right.
and that kind of stuff. and they make some rolls, and they see basically what happened. Like this faction attacks this one.
So there's
And
dynamism built in that's not predicted.
yes,
It is determined, but not predicted. Right.
yes, yeah. Is there's some space for the GM to say, okay, this I think this faction wants to do this, but then there's rules to determine
Right.
if it accomplishes it or not.
That's sort of amusing. You're the GM and you say, okay, I want the pirates to attack, and the pirate's like, no. But sorry,
I'm doing other things right now.
I'm sort of
They attack them, they just like lose.
Right,
maybe.
right. I'm sort of amused by that, but go on.
But yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. What about the player characters then?
That's the thing. Player characters only will come into contact with this either. That's the interesting part, because in addition to that, there's also instructions to create adventures for the players, and you create the adventure to decide, well, this is going to be like the concept of the adventure. This is going to be maybe this faction is involved, maybe these other two as well, and it's the hook for the players. So that's where the players come into contact with factions. But the idea is that to some degree, factions are there, and players only come into contact with part of some of them at some specific time, and only maybe heard from the others through rumors or
Right.
news broadcasts or whatever.
Well, this is kind of interesting to me because actually it's a little more it's a little less free than I thought. Okay, let me give you an example. Let's take any of the classic games of the 1990s. We could take Feng Shui, we could take Legends of the Five Rings, we could take Deadlands, we could take... There's like a dozen or 20 other titles I could mention, very much published according to written with the same philosophy. And all of them are based on the idea that you have a bunch of competing factions in a given area, and that you have to hook the player characters in. And that's the word. That's where the word started being used, to hook them in. And it was always, well, some of the games had features of the characters built in, like the girlfriend who always gets into trouble. And by definition, that was sort of a tacit agreement between the player and the GM that, okay, if I say your girlfriend's in trouble, you have to come. Others said, well, they purported to be very free because you accepted as a player that your character would be hooked, but you got to make up how. You got to say, well, I'm here because of my mother, or I'm here because of my job, I'm here because of a mysterious note I got, or something. A lot of this goes all the way back to Call of Cthulhu from decades before. The adventure is there. Mask of Nyarlathotep is totally like this. Here's the adventure. It's there to be done. Get your ass in there. Oh, and by the way, here's the note you got from your weird aunt who said, get over here. And period. You do this or you don't play. I don't mean to be too terribly negative about this, but who cares if you have this role-driven dynamism if all you're doing is hooking them in and sticking their asses in that adventure when you feel like it anyway.
I'm becoming a little bit disenchanted because I came into contact with this game through an actual play that I really, really loved, and I wasn't aware of that the adventure hooks were there.
Illusionism. You felt so free at the time. Yeah.
I guess it wasn't illusionism, but it was like a more honest about it. But yeah, there's an interesting thing I found. There's a section in the book, in the Game Master Guide, called Sandbox Gaming and You. And it talks a little bit about what these games consider to be. Yes, a start with a number is designed to accommodate a particular style of play known as, most commonly, as sandbox gaming. Sandbox gaming relies on two things: a group of players willing to take initiative in seeking adventure, and a GM willing to make a world large and interesting enough to be worth the exploration. And a little bit after that, it says, first, sandbox gaming creates emergent stories. With many gaming styles, players assume to follow a specific narrative arc that is tightly bound to a pre-existing story. The emerging story created in a sandbox game are different. The GM does not have a single prearranged story on hand that he expects to fit the players into. And this comes to the interesting part. He has many potential stories for many potential places, all of them locales that the players may or may not visit.
This is very important. Just because you give the dungeon multiple doors doesn't mean it stops being a dungeon.
Yeah.
It's a great sentence.
Yeah. Yeah, so that, Angel, you nailed that one. That's really interesting. So the difference just seems to be for very standard adventuring of the kind I just described, which actually isn't dungeoning, you just have a lot and they change when nobody's looking, so exactly what it's like when the players are hooked into it that particular time is dynamic. It basically sounds like making that older style of gaming just more fun for the GM, you know, which is cool. Fine. Yeah, I'm not saying that's a bad design, but it's kind of interesting. It doesn't really seem to go with that emergent stories claim that he makes in the beginning, does it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps creating the. I don't want to say illusion because people could kill me for that. The perception of total freedom, but it is not completely there. I guess players can always say, "Yeah, fuck all your hooks. I'm going to go."
Yeah, we're going to assume that we're not going to do that, though. You know, let's assume that we're not going to do that and talk about successful play. The what amounts to a table flip is not really freedom, right? I mean, we're talking about the enjoyment of freedom as a part of functional play. So,
well, that just puts the onus on the GM, right, to make it all connected and cause and effect chained and make it feel like it's actually building and going someplace, as opposed to being assigned to them.
Well, and also let's take that model that we've talked about, but maybe not enough, which is the other model that I think that the term or ways to play that include the term are trying to avoid, and that's what it just said, a single prearranged thing to do. Apparently that singleness is so offensive that having 5 of them and you don't know which one they're going to go to, that in and of itself is better. Right? The idea that you have a string of encounters very much like a digestive system, and you went in that mouth and you are coming out the butthole, and that is how it is. Right? Or in that order, right? You're hitting the esophagus first, and then you're hitting the stomach, and that's how it is. And if you think I'm joking, look at any set of modules for example, 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. Anything for Spelljammer, anything for Al-Qadim, anything for Dark Sun, any of those. And they're really elaborate. I mean, they have got booklets for the GM, booklets for the players. They've got maps like you can't believe. As far as the raw fictional content is concerned, they're actually really impressive. You know, there's nothing like the Mountain of the Assassins. That's not the name of the module, but it's basically the Assassin's Mountain city. You know, for Al-Qadim. I mean, it's a horse choker of magnificent design. But every single adventure, you are scruffed and you go from 1 to 1 to 1, and it says so. It says if they don't go, make them. If they don't go, the wizard blasts them with a fireball and makes them. Nice. You know, period. You're going here next, and you found this out. You know, after you've killed the ghouls, you find the clue. The clue says, go here. And if you don't do this, you ain't playing. Because that's what we do. And that is, I think, it's the story equivalent of the A to B dungeon.
Right.
It's the event equivalent of the A to B dungeon, and it's what, as you know, I consider, at least in terms of my play preferences, anathema. Right. And yet, what is the word that is associated with this mode of play above all others? Story. Mm-hmm. And that's why you find in today the strangely weird at least in my experience, the strangely weird perceived dichotomy. Either it's story play or it's sandbox play. And people who play, in my perception, with a lot of emergent story, would die 1,000 deaths before ever admitting that they ever cared about a story. Because to them, that means straightforward, GM-driven, go here next. Right. And that is it. We have these two kind of boogeymen, these bugbears, if I may use the term, in the room. One of which is the A to B dungeon, and the other of which is the A to B story railroad. Right. And I'm beginning to get the idea that anything, no matter what it is, that can't be identified as one of those, literally as one of those, gets to be called sandbox. Even if it is. Do you see a defining feature of sandbox to be that the story is supposed to be emergent from the choices the players make? In fact, far from it. And I'll show you a good example. Yeah. For example, in Bone Hill, there is no story. None. Right? So never mind that. That's a moot point. Second, right. And doesn't have to be. Not if you're doing it as a dungeon. It's actually a pretty freaking good dungeon. You're above grounds most of the time, but it's still a dungeon. So there's that. And then there's also what I'm about to tell you about with Against the Cult of the Reptile God. And here I'm going to say that, no, I don't think there's a single term that defines sandbox at all. The only thing, what I'm saying is I think it is merely neither an A to B dungeon. Even if it's a dungeon with 5 exits and 5 entrances, that counts. It's not A to B, so it's a sandbox. I see. Or it's not a railroaded hooked module. Oh, except that if you have 5 of them and they're a little bit more dynamic in their construction, then that's okay. Even if the play experience of doing one is nothing but the same old, same old. I'm saying that I find the term actually to be rather dishonest. That's me. Mm-hmm. 20 people watching this video are about to scream and extol sandbox play as the great and the be-all, and I obviously don't understand. Let me tell you about Against the Cult of the Reptile God, which is best understood as Innsmouth in Greyhawk. Nice. It's not fish, it's lizards and cobras, but the idea is the same. The player characters go to a little town, and by the way, just like Bone Hill, which was for levels 2 through 4, this one's for levels 1 through 3. And this is very important because up until this point in the early 80s, finding modules, adventures that were set for beginning characters had been thin on the ground. So hard, yeah. And so this was a big deal. This is part of the N series, which was specifically built to be an out-of-the-box campaign series of modules or set of modules that you used to shepherd your beginning players at starting levels. Gotcha. That they were built for, they may be among the first to do that. Mm-hmm. So then the N series is very famous. Now the different modules in them are not connected. They are extremely dubiously placed in hexes in the world of Greyhawk, in my opinion. I think the module was written and used, and then someone said, "Oh, okay, make it in Greyhawk," and
just throw it over there.
Yeah, exactly. But that's just me. Anyway, but the Against the Cult of the Reptile God is this: there's a small village, rural village called Orlane. You go there, and you can wander about, in which case you will meet helpless, rather stupid villagers who can't tell you very much. You will meet weird, dangerous encounters, like a reptilian creature will jump out from under a boulder and try to kill you, or some of the various townspeople will be shifty and weird and look at you out of the side of your eyes and try to bushwhack you. Okay, so you can kind of wander around having these slightly dangerous, slightly mysterious encounters all over the place. Then there are several people who will be happy to talk to you, all of whom will tell you that something is dreadfully wrong here and they would appreciate some help. Strangely enough, you're a party of 1 to 3 levels. Levels 1 to 3. They comprise no less than 6 characters of considerably higher level, all of whom are quite dangerous, none of whom seem to quite get off their asses to do much. But regardless, there they are. And they will all tell you, be careful, this place is dangerous, we're trying to figure it out, can you help us? There are 2 inns to stay at. One of which is called the Slumbering Serpent, which might make you think that is the scary one, the one to avoid. No, that's the good one. Then there's the Golden Grain Inn, which is the cult infestation.
Nice.
And if you stay there, they'll bop you in the head in the night and drag you off to a holding pens, and then eventually drag you off to the dungeon on the outside of town where the Naga will eat you, or try to convert you. And if you can't be converted, he'll eat you. So that's a trap. That's a trap door. You got to look out for the Golden Grain Inn. You go in there, you ain't coming out unless you get some serious.
You should have given spoiler warnings at the beginning in case someone was planning on playing.
Well, let me tell you. This is the town, and that sounds kind of interesting. But the important point is that none of those other NPCs are going to do jack shit.
Mm.
The other important point is even if you go to the Temple of America, seriously, America.
All right.
If you go to the Temple of America and you'll discover that it's infested by the cult and the 2 evil clerics there, even if you confront them and kill them, you still haven't solved the problem. Because the problem is the Naga who lives on the outskirts of town. Yes. So even if you take it all the way up to like running in there and killing those clerics, nothing really changes. Mm-hmm. And the only way you will get to that outskirts dungeon is either to have been taken there through being kidnapped at the Golden Grain Inn, or running into Ramni, who is the 7th level magic user who lives on the outskirts of town too. He is loaded for bear. Ramni by himself can take down your party. He is one badass wizard. Well, he's been waiting for just the right people to help him take down the cult. Evidently, for some reason, all those other high-level characters in the town will not do. And they, by the way, think he's crazy and warn the characters away from him.
Nice.
Well, whatever. Sooner or later, they run into Ramni. Ramni runs into them, and Ramni says, "We shall go. I know the secret of the cult. We shall go." If they refuse, he sends his familiar, which means he can show up later. I mean, you aren't getting rid of him. He sticks to you.
Right.
And it even has a whole kind of verbal flowchart of how they might or might not agree, might or might not agree, might or might not agree to all these layers of offers from Ramni. Finally, it says in the, exhausted, finally it's like, and if they disagree with that, the GM has to get them to the dungeon some other way. So the point is, until that time, you ain't going to the dungeon out there. By the way, it's kind of a cool little dungeon. It's muddy and tunnels and stuff like that. It's not made of brick and whatever. And the Naga's a pretty ferocious foe. But the point is that you ain't going there until the GM basically throws Ramni at you.
Opens the door.
Second, if you don't go with that door, he's booting you through it anyway.
Yeah.
So this is Bobby G. I don't know if you've been familiar. I invented the term Bobby G at the Forge, and I made everybody angry.
No, don't
Bobby
know.
G is when you find the clue and all it gets you is another fight, and you get in another fight and all you get is another clue, and all that does is get you another fight, and you go around and around and around, and nobody tells you anything. Everybody hints at something, nobody, blah, 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 and this goes on forever. And I don't care what skill rolls you make. Goes on forever, and then somebody tells you to meet the guy. You hear about the guy. And and he is usually a mid-level functionary of some kind, right? He's a fixer of some kind who isn't loyal to the villain. He's like a mid-level corporate guy who's willing to think on his company. Or Bobby G lives in every Shadowrun adventure ever written, right? And you will meet Bobby G, and Bobby G will tell you that the deal is going down in the warehouse tomorrow night.
So you're just running circles until you meet Bobby G.
Exactly. And another, when I described this to a very experienced role player friend of mine, he said, "Oh yeah, I call that the Panama Canal." You can sail around the Atlantic all you want until finally the DM shows you the Panama Canal, and you get to go over there, and it's in the Pacific where the pirate ship is, or the thing is that you do.
Right.
Yeah, you can do as many choices as you want.
Right.
Until you find the right choice.
Well, but you won't even find
that.
Right. You won't even find it until he gives it to you. Because that's not dramatic enough, or it's not time yet. That's the important thing about it. You can't find Bobby G. He has to be provided. And so
did you have a particular character named Bobby G that you came up with?
Actually, unfortunately, I didn't. I was just trying to describe it, and it clicked into mind and I visualized him. He was like a Shadowrun NPC. I visualized him so perfectly that I said, "Okay, that's the one." And it stung people at the Forge so badly. Some of them have not forgiven me to this day. I think
because they had employed Bobby, it struck too close to home?
I think so. The idea being that they consider themselves non-railroady GMs because of all this choice that they gave and prided themselves on that. And I had taken off, I had pulled back the shower curtain, you know.
Right.
But the idea is that this is a beautifully and wonderfully incoherently phrased. I'm going to provide it. You know, I'll provide a scan or something with the seminar, because their attempts to not admit this while directing you to do it verbally are priceless. Mm-hmm. You just cannot. If you read what they write literally, you're like, it's what we read about Restonford. You're like, what on earth are you saying? Until you finally realize that it's all just cover for saying, look, when you want, give them Ramney. Period. And so now there's some weirdnesses. There's an assassin character who's working with the cult who has concealed the fact that he wasn't hypnotized by the Naga. And he's like got his cool stats. He's a pretty cool stat block. And he's like aching to be played. But that's it. They provide him in a room, and that's it. They never say another word about him, really. Even though he's clearly the most interesting character in the entire setup. And the two clerics in particular could be interesting and are bland as dirt. You would think that, like, destroying the temple that sits front and center in the town would be of some interest.
Should have ramifications.
Right. I mean, and maybe you're supposed to be good enough to DM to know that you're supposed to have that the players that could go to the other cool NPCs and like mounts an expedition against the temple. Maybe, but there's no word of any such thing. And if you look at how those characters are to be played, they will not help the player characters until after the player characters may do such a thing. It's pretty clear you're supposed to go off to the dungeon with just you guys and Ramney. Hmm. So, anyway, but do you see what I'm getting at? This is a good friend of mine who I will only name in this seminar with his permission. I'll write him.
Gotcha.
Who has written extensively about Gygaxiana, has referred to this module as a shining example of Gygaxian naturalism. Hmm. By which he means it's just a village with a lot going on, and whatever the players do, they do. And yet, when you look at it, that's anything but the case. It is a Bobby G situation. Yeah. And go ahead.
I'm starting to see kind of like the start with the number sandbox style as a response to that.
Right.
To be able to kind of at the end, yes, the GM is just providing like a few branches to go, with the difference that these branches are like generated. There's no like an end. Okay, you finally find Bobby G,
right?
And then you get to the end of the thing, and also to give him tools to make that easier. Yeah, is the same thing without like a clear endpoint, and a clear path. It's still like being okay. You have these choices. You can choose Coca-Cola or Pepsi,
Right.
and it's just, it doesn't really matter which one, but you have choices. So that's good, right? But at least there's no like an end point that the GM has to force you through.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, and so I think that's really. I agree. It's clear that people have read many scenarios, and I would actually blame Shadowrun. Many people of the mid 40s generation of role players right now cut their teeth on Shadowrun adventures, and very similar things. And most of White Wolf modules were like this too, and very painfully realized that they weren't really creating brilliant stories through character play the way they had been promised. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that a lot of people are going to find all kinds of mechanical ways to make it palatable. The question is, when are they making it palatable, and when are they doing something different entirely? Right? And the trouble is, the word sandbox is being thrown at anything that isn't those two things I mentioned. So it's not helping.
In the case of Against the Cult of the Reptile God, are you saying people consider the village part to be sandboxy?
That is very much what is meant by the term Gygaxian naturalism. Because you see, by around 1980, there was a philosophical split going on. On the grounds, Dungeons and Dragons had become a tournament kill competition.
Right.
In the hands of at least some of its creative team, they wanted anything but that. They wanted real time. The exhortations to use real time for everything in your setting in the DM guide written by Gygax for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons are extensive, with capital letter words and bold-faced words, and it is an impassioned rant. Don't just play this like what you and I would call a video game, which didn't exist back then. Don't do it. Time matters. It takes this long to make that magic sword. You can't have the magic user go along with the fighter on this particular expedition. He's making the magic sword. Pay attention to the time, damn it. And there's passion in those words. So you're reaching back to some philosophical splits. When somebody says Gygaxian naturalism, they mean that kind of in-game causality going on all the time, just like you said, with time on Hell, with the time mattering for everything, and then whatever the players do has to be in that context and constrained by it. So since that, can you read the Cult of the Reptile God and you say, oh, see, look, the players can go anywhere on the map. They can do whatever, and time goes by, and there's even a thing, if 2 weeks go by, blah, 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 that kind of thing, that's there. So not that much happens. It's not like, the cult rises up. Right. It just, basically what it means is Remney gets bored and comes looking for the characters.
Right.
So that's what it means.
Right.
So but the point is that that's enough to kick off the kind of, oh, there it is, from many readers.
Right.
No railroading here. Right. So it's not just a dungeon, it's a situated spot of danger in a much more naturalistic environment, which is one of the big ideals in general. And I like it. The Haunted Ruins actually qualifies, which is by Greg Stafford for RuneQuest, and it's a troll community, which is I think one of the most beautiful naturalistic environments and sets of personalities. It's full of what I would later call a relationship map, ties of kin and sex that are sitting there as realities, and instead of dictating program behavior, are their context for responsive behavior.
Right. What did you call that one? It's called the Haunted Hills?
No, this one's called the Haunted Ruins.
The Haunted Ruins.
Yeah,
gotcha.
And it has no story to go through. There are no sequences of what happens next at all.
It's all fueled by that relationship.
Right, because you can't run it as a dungeon. They'll kill you.
Right.
They are you try to go in there as a kill fest, and your ass is grass. They are just too much, and they're too interesting. And there's a beautiful pull-out picture. It's just so gorgeous. The pull-out picture, which is so gorgeous, that shows the human adventurers who are looking very Gloranthan, which means they have a lot of identity. They don't just look like a party.
Gotcha.
And they're in there in the court, the underground court, and there are all the right trolls looking like themselves, doing things that are characteristic of their personalities. And the reactions of everybody is very pregnant with tension and opportunity.
Nice.
And it's social. It is social role-playing. Full of possibilities. You could end up with some of the trolls don't like each other at all and would be perfectly happy to engage with these outsiders in some kind of power bid. In fact, I'll boast a little bit. When I was talking, this is in the early 2000s, when I was talking with Greg Stafford about the way Adventures for the Hero Wars would be the most powerful for what the game had to offer, he said, yes, I agree, like the Haunted Ruins. Which is when I went off and got it. I had a lot of Gloranthan material all the way from the late 70s, but I didn't have that.
Didn't have that one.
So I went back and it's been published several times. I have the Avalon Hill version, which is basically just rules updated from the original.
Right.
But yeah, you don't attack the Haunted Ruins. It's a place to encounter, to interact with, to go away from, to return to develop relationships with characters with, possibly get yourself killed through a misunderstanding. It is RuneQuest. It's not exactly forgiving, but it's genuinely dangerous. Nobody said this is just pretty tea and cupcakes role playing.
Right.
We didn't have to roll. No, none of that is involved. It is a scary, dangerous place. So, but it's fascinating and full of interactions.
When you talked to Greg Stafford about that, I realized this is a little bit of a detour, but had you already been working on your whole relationship map theory, and
yes,
had Troll Babe already been in existence?
This is going together. Troll Babe was not.
Yeah.
But Sorcerer's Soul had already been published for years.
Yeah.
And actually Troll Babe thematically emerged out of our Hero Wars game, which ran for a long time.
Okay.
But anyway, so that's the Haunted Ruins, and I won't go into that too much here, except as really the most profound version of that principle. If you're talking about three things, Passages of Time isn't that. How am I going to put it? In RuneQuest play, Passage of Time is taken seriously, so seriously that no one ever mentions it. You're just doing it that way.
Gotcha.
This turn of the seasons, what holy day is coming up, and all of that. If you're doing Glorantha right, you know what holy day is next. And what the implications of that are for this or that cult or person.
Gotcha.
So that's one thing. So the other thing is being able to come and go. There are lots of ways to interact with the Haunted Ruins initially and later. You're not expected to go in and be trapped unless you can come out or anything like that. Nor is there any particular story that is intended to be told. This is not the tale of the fall of the Haunted Ruins. This is not the tale of the emergence of the troll army or anything like that. So as far as all those variables at once being concerned, this is probably the single published module I can think of. Somebody's free to correct me. It's the only one I know that qualifies.
Interesting.
So that's sort of my take on that. Now, so you have, of course, brought my game, and you just mentioned Troll Babe.
I did.
So
I brought Troll Babe.
In this case, tell us all how this one rolls.
Well, all right. So the way this works is that there are maps within the game, in case you didn't know. So there's one map on the large world scale. There's another map that cuts in closer, and then there's the closest of all map as well. So after you create your characters, which is a quick process, your characters always begin the adventure on the move. They're going someplace. They're on their feet, and they're walking to a location. And you get to point out on the map what that location is. And there's a list of names with each map. There are 6 locations. So you can just choose one, for example, the Blood Gate. My character's going to the Blood Gate. And that's where the GM then gets to step back and create a happening or a set of tensions that's at the Blood Gate for the troll babe to walk into.
As the author, I'll point out that those are not in the book. The process of adventure creation is completely generic, and therefore it's not like something's waiting at the Blood Gate.
No, sorry. Yes, right. That's exactly right. The Blood Gate is just a name.
Right.
You don't even have a clear shot on the map of like what the Blood Gate might look like. It's just a name that exists on the map, and that's for the GM to decide. Yeah. What
I've also played in which people looked at the map and found one of those weird little details that the artist saw fit to stick in, of which there are many, and says I'm going there, which is also legal because
which is nameless, right? Yeah, absolutely.
There's nothing in the rules that said you have to go somewhere that's named.
That's exactly right. It's anywhere on this map you can put your pin and say I'm going there. And obviously it scales because the game cares about scale. As your troll babe goes up, their actions can affect the entire continent.
Right.
Etc.
So the other important thing about it is that sad to say, from some perspectives, the adventure is in fact there. You're not getting out. Actually, the troll babe can walk out, but even doing that is a conflict.
That's right.
But you're in it. You're in it, and you've got to get out of it either the easy way or the hard way. And sometimes what looks like the easy way turns out to be the hard way, depending on the role. And so it's got you stuck. You're in tar paper.
Well, yeah, because as opposed to the GM writing a hook for your character,
you've already committed.
All the NPCs hook you, right? Because all the NPCs want something from you to help their cause, to get involved in it. Or
to kill you.
They latch onto you, or to kill you because they think you're there to mess up their plans. Whatever it is, they hook you, as opposed to you trying to hook the character.
Right, and so the other thing about it is that it inspired by Everway, by the way. Every adventure has a thing that will will go this way or that way. Will actually happen due to the effects. Either it can happen as a functioning feature of play as the result of a conflict, or it can happen basically, everything else happened and the troll babe's left. Well, then you decide how that turns out. But no matter what, it will. And you don't even tell the player what that is. It's just your way.
It's irrelevant to the player.
Right. Yeah. It's just your way of thinking about the importance of the troll babe's presence.
Right.
So what's interesting about this is just how sandboxy is it. By some definitions, that the player can go wherever they want, it is. But on the other hand, since it doesn't matter, that may not count. Because you're going to make up you may be inspired by the name or the little picture yourself. When the player points to it, I tend to say, oh, Bloodgate, what could, I get that. But on the other hand, it's true that wherever they pick, you're going to undergo the same procedure to make up what they encounter. You'll probably even use the same simple little relationship map that you have kicking around in your notebook anyway.
Yeah.
So
that is exactly true.
So therefore, its sandboxiness in terms of travel, I'm not going to take any credit for that. I don't think that's very sandboxy at all. It's very colorful, but it's not really player freedom to choose the adventure. It's not as though there are different things happening across the continent. They decide which one's more important to them.
That's true.
It's not there.
But that then says that in the sandbox, the characters need to know what they're heading toward.
Well, in many cases, I find that the information is crucial in play of this kind. You could go here, where you want to go. Well, what's happening there? What's happening there? And then
you want
in
to
some
stop
games,
the orcs here or stop the assassins there, or fight the
well, but it's usually not presented as meta. It's presented as possibly flawed information that the characters are getting, and that's very, very well built into many, many games. Angel, did you have anything to say or suggest about that?
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about after looking the modules that you brought and start with a number is, as I said, I think there's yeah, like it's a clear evolution of that initial. Okay, you are supposed to be able to go whenever you want, but it doesn't really matter
Right.
because these clear endpoints that the gene has to drag you into eventually, and then it starts with a number. Similar games came and said like, okay, there's going to be like an amount, only like this amount of real choices, but there's not like an endpoint. The gene doesn't really have to drag you into any particular one, and once you go through all of them, a few others open up, and also here's some tools to make this easy and
Right.
original
Right. Well, and also
then,
you don't have to like completely construct it because you can let the roles and the dynamism get somewhere on its own,
yeah. So
which is a
it's,
good technique. I'm not complaining. Right.
yeah, I find that like an evolution of that to make it more functional
Right.
and to be able to reduce the amount of GM bullshit you need to do that.
Right. But it doesn't create emergent stories as such.
But one interesting
Right.
thing I was thinking is that there's Blades in the Dark, which is heavily inspired by Start With a Number. I Start With a Number, John Harper played for a long time, which takes some things from Start With a
Yeah.
Number.
I've played Blades in the Dark. Yeah.
Yeah, namely the faction turn is
Right.
somewhat there, but then it gives like it makes sure that the player has real freedom to decide what to do, and there you can try to take that away, but the system will fight you
Uh-huh. Interesting.
a lot.
Yeah. We should talk
Yeah.
about that game, I think, in the comments later because that's a pretty developed game. So
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's got a lot
Yeah,
of
Start With
different
a Number.
parts. Yeah.
Yeah, Start With a Number. I find is like a response to many things in traditional games that John Harper maybe found interesting, but said I can do it better.
What you mean, Blades in the Dark?
Blades in the Dark,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. The case of Trollbabe is interesting. I will make the claim,
Hmm.
possibly biased, that it gives rise to local emergent stories. And the Trollbabe's personal journey from one to the next, to the next, to the next, does produce an emergent story that often has a larger arc of heroism or drama or tragedy or something like that that bears, I mean, especially because there's so many relationships that come in and out and things happen to the relationships, that particular story on the long term is extremely emergent. Also, precisely what the Trollbabe does in one of these situations is highly consequential. There is no way to reserve one of the opponents as the tough one, right, that you have to build up to. There's no way to do that. There's no way to reserve a sequence of events from occurring in particular orders, right? There's no way to do that at all.
Sure.
So, anyway, I would venture to say that here you have no sandboxiness at all in terms of where you go on the map. But you do have completely emergent stories that are completely... Bobby G is absent. There is no fake way to structure the story inside that purports to have the players not notice. Right? That doesn't happen. So again, this is a disconnect between, okay, if you say time matters, if you say location, freedom to travel among location matters, and emergent plot relative to the characters matter. If you say those are what does it, then we're not finding a lot of games or adventures that do it.
Right.
And even ones that really trumpet themselves as sandboxes can clearly be shown to be missing one or another of these components and to focus on one of them.
Right.
So, I never called Trollbabe a sandbox or whatever, but I certainly would have said, I don't think the term existed in 2003 when I first released it, but I certainly would say that I consider it a very wide open game that is not railroaded.
Right.
So, however, if you make the mistake in the wrong company of saying this game is about making stories, they'll get mad and say, oh, okay, it's one of those little railroaded scenarios,
Right.
that I'm so sick of. So you have to be careful with the terminology. So that's what I'm saying. These different terms, like this term sandbox is thrown in from computer gaming, and it doesn't really seem to fit, does it? You can't really like turn it this way or that way and slot it into the way adventures or modules or role-playing games or whatever are constructed. It's not a good fit.
Right. It seems almost too broad a term in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Right. So I'd also wanted to tell you about, speaking of all the Haunted Highlands.
And there is a lot of haunted too.
Yeah, yeah.
What's in the Haunted Highlands?
Well, the Haunted Highlands, as I said, is a first of a series of adventure modules written for Castles and Crusades. And one thing that distinguishes it is that it is, like the End series, built to start with beginning characters. You make up characters and you start here. And you play. And you're more or less... There's a larger setting of which this is a piece, and the later modules take you elsewhere. So you don't stay in the Haunted Highlands as you level up. You stay there for a couple of levels, and then you're big enough to go off to the other adventures. But they don't fit together well, these different things, and their sequential nature, in my opinion, looks pretty after the fact. It's pretty likely that they had been developed through play in very different circumstances, and then they decided to make a level-up sequence and stitch them. So, because, frankly, the Haunted Highlands, in and of itself, is a whole rock and roll setting of its own. What is it? What is it? It's a barbaric region, right? So you've got bawdy, rowdy hill tribes. One in particular is very well developed. And then you have a bunch of sort of rustic dangers scattered around. And then you have a bar where the characters are presumed to live if they are out-of-towners. They're sort of presumed to be out-of-towners who are living at this bar. And then they use that as their headquarters to go roaming about different places, again, based on rumors. At first glance, the whole thing is just like The Secret of Bone Hill, especially because the different encounters are very carefully rated by level. You're supposed to go to a couple of them while you're still little, and then you've gained enough weight that you can go and address some of the others. One of them is tenuously connected to the larger setting, but notably, it's way off in the corner and doesn't have anything to do with anything else. So that may be like the stitch point, by which this was hooked. The rest are very interesting because they could be treated as individual pest control. There's a bog, there's ogres in the bog who raid out of the bog, there's a witch in the middle of the bog, and you could go and just basically clean them out. There are a couple of other things that are a bit like that, but there are some other things that aren't in Bone Hill at all, which run entirely counter to that approach. So it's kind of like you're reading this, and if you tilt your head this way, you see the open-air dungeon. If you tilt your head this way, you see something else entirely. And that's if you're reading for a lot of the characterizations. And admittedly, looking for ways to make it make sense. You have to project a little.
Right. Sure.
But you'll find some really interesting things. You'll find that the leader of the tribe is a really interesting person with a badass daughter. You will find that his brother is over there in the Druid Grove. You will find that the priestess of the Druids is a weird, scary chick. Like, really weird. And that the green man giant who lives there is dangerous as hell. Well, this is technically the religion of the tribe. But there's another religion of the tribe, which is sort of a chaos jester kind of guy. The opportunities afforded by his worship are interesting. You have kind of Zen barbarian priests who walk around being obnoxious. And
That's
so,
cool.
I know. And so by this point, you're going, well, wait a minute. I don't want to be an outsider living at the bar. I want to be like one of these dudes. This is like, there's factions and stuff. This is interesting. Now,
but it's not presented that way. You just sort of have to make the connections.
You have to. There's enough content there that you don't have to project very far.
Nice.
It's not like, to do that with Bone Hill, you have to make shit up out of nothing. To do that here, all you do is read that paragraph and then read it again and say, wait a minute, did I just read that? you know. And so because it didn't have anything to do with how hard the Green Man was to kill, you're like, why is that chick so weird? Right. So then there's one other thing, which is front and center on the cover, by the way, which has the sexiest mummy in the history of role playing. She has an exposed belly button. And that's not all. Okay. So in the graveyard of the haunted of the region, which is the barbarian graveyard, which they haven't used for a long time, and doesn't say why, there's a whole bunch of cool-ass undead. And the point is that they don't cause any trouble. They only just started causing trouble because 2 foreign assholes came in and started looting the graves. And have roused them, and now, like, zombies are walking around causing trouble and stuff like that. But the point is that they were behaving themselves. And it is very, very clear when you get in there that if you try to take on the mummy, she'll wax you. I mean, she's way over your level. I mean, she's nothing to be messed with. And if you read it, you get the idea the authors are pretty clear on what really ought to happen. You ought to make nice to the mummy and make sure that she gets the tomb robbers. And then everybody's cool. So there's a little bit of kind of fixed ending built into that little sector. But then you look at it, and then I will not bore you, but I actually have a whole write-up that you have to piece together from different places in the module to create the chronological history. Because it's not given. Right. You have to find it, but all the pieces are there. That the witch in the bogs, the priestess of the Green Man, and the queen who was the mummy must have been contemporaries.
Nice.
And that there's some deep relationship among them that defines the spiritual network of this region.
So there's like a hidden R-map inside, underneath all of this
you
stuff.
have to draw a couple of those points yourself. You have to you have to squint and push.
But it gestures towards
yes, the gesture is real. And you're kind of like, somebody took a really cool setting here and turned it into an open-air dungeon.
Right. That's cool.
For publication for Castles and Crusades, right, is my guess. The author can come and tell me I'm full of shit, that this was all like de novo Castles and Crusades, if he wants to. But the point is, this is one of these things which is, due to its writing, the purpose of play is binary. And you can't do both. You certainly, one of these is enough gun. The way you would play it and GM it would be vastly different. And the reasons people came, the overt human reasons to be playing, are so different that you can't mix and match as you go or make it up as you go. Yeah, there's a history section that's so brief it might as well not be there, and has nothing. I mean, it does not tell you a thing about all these other things. Yeah, but yeah, it's a little strange. The areas of adventure are considered fluid and ever changing. But I will point out that if you go to one of those spots, it's what it is, no matter when you go.
Right, it's always there.
It's always there like that.
Yeah.
So, like, especially the tombs. You always address the tombs right at the time that the dead are just starting to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And just after the robbers have gotten into a few places.
No matter when you get there.
Right, exactly. So it says fluid and ever-changing, but I don't know what that means relative to what they absolutely... The nature of, therefore, a module or even a game, in terms of its scenario creation, that purports to be sandbox, or uses language that's very, very close to that in some way. Present. So there's a lot, I'm saying there's a lot of weaseling about this out there right now. Sure. And it's a term that is gaining power as a marketing term, or it already has. It's a term that is considered superior in some way to some other kind of play. And as far as I can tell, it's two extremely specialized kinds of play that it can't be. But anything else, evidently, can. and you just say so. You just say it is.
Right. You can just call it a sandbox.
Right.
As long as it's not forcing you from A to B in and out, or A to B by a sequence of events and story notches.
And the flexibility away from that is very, very forgiving. All you have to do is have 3 doors instead of 1. Or you can do the roads to Rome thing. Well, look, you can go anywhere. You can go anywhere. You can go anywhere. Except you're gonna face the big guy at the end.
Right.
Cool, guys. Do you want to follow up on anything that this brings to mind? I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I've got a question, but why don't you go ahead if you've got anything?
Yeah, I think I'm starting to see what you're saying about. It seems sandbox is a term that is not defining what something is, but more what something is not, at least in theory.
And they're 2 different things, perhaps same in principle, but very different in appearance and application. And they're both very extreme. So there's no structure to what's left, you see? Is what I'm saying. There's no structure or common principle among what is excluded, or rather what is included with Sandbox.
Yeah.
I mean, if there were, that'd be great, but I can't see one. Freedom seems to be an awfully squishy term when it comes to role-playing, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Because freedom is the ability to impact, right? There's freedom to move where you want.
Right.
And there's freedom to go where you want when you want.
I guess, yeah. Go ahead, Angel.
I read a really quote that when I read it, I related it a lot to illusionism, which says, the right to choose is not the same as having the right to choose is not the same as having the right to have meaningful choices.
Right. Well, again, speaking as an American, regardless of citizen-wise anyway,
as an
not
expat,
residents.
Yes.
Yeah, I would have to say that that's extremely familiar to me as a
it was referring to that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like you had addressed the styles of play, which you had arrayed.
Well, I think I did a little bit with the Haunted Highlands points to that for me.
Okay.
The idea being that you could use. It's not like the module is flexible. It's basically like the module has 2 lenses that you can look at it through, and that in that case you can actually see different purposes of play at work.
The point depending on what the group wants to play.
And in my opinion, what that really means is that the term sandbox cannot be identified with a single purpose of play.
Which I agree.
Right. And so that's where I'm at too. So it's another example of the lack of structure of the term.
Right.
Sort of where I'm aiming at with that.
I mean, I was thinking about Vincent Baker's phrase, what you're playing to find out.
Right.
At some point, he replaced creative agendas with what are you playing to find out in terms of his fruitful thinking about design.
Right.
And so, and that seems to me where choice actually comes in, right? If you're just playing to find out, can you get through?
Right.
Or do you complete the adventure?
Well, do you have what it takes to get through?
Or do you have what it takes, right?
That's what really matters, yeah.
We're playing to see A or B, right? You're playing to see if you make it or if you don't make it, if you have it or if you don't have it. Right. Versus we're playing to see what you create in this scenario or what you...
I think all role-playing does that. I think that here you're playing to see... Another alternative is you're playing to find the emotional or social sense of crisis, What do you recognize? Right. Where are you in this, right? Either negatively or positively. Where are you in this fiction? Where, how do you relate to it? What gets you? Where do your fears kick in? Where do your hopes kick in? Where's your engagement as an audience member who also has agency via a character or some other instrument? Those are purposes of play that I can definitely understand. The purpose of play to simply enjoy it because of its beauty or its quality or its craftsmanship, its aesthetic features, whatever, that's all role-playing.
Sure.
So that's not a purpose of play. That's, as I've been on about this for a long time, that's the fabric, right? And just saying you want a really great fabric and you want to contribute to a really great fabric, I'm saying, well, join the club.
Yeah, that's
So,
part of the game.
One question remains. If you were to be designing either a scenario for a game you like a published scenario, and that's the trouble, right? Making something for play, so many things are nicely locked down. You're going to be using it. You don't have to convince yourself, right? Exactly. You don't have to have you understand. But to make a published scenario out of it is a much more brutally and demanding process, which is honored more in the mistaking, in the failure, right? In the honorable attempt than it is in the actual realization of the endeavor. So the question then is, how do you explain where the freedom lies? How do you say, okay, you're free about this, but you're not about that? How do you say, I mean, there's one of the Lamentations of the Flame Princess modules, the one where there's this huge chaos worm underneath the church. The thing that crawls, maybe.
I don't know.
But his introduction is actually quite, well, it is Jim Raggi. It's quite assertive. And it says, yeah, this adventure takes place in these things, in the catacombs underneath this church. And I tell you a little bit about what's up ground, but get him in there. You may call this a railroad, he says. And he goes, fine, choo-choo. And it's interesting because I read that and I was like, wow, Jim, this is like right before we met face to face. And I was like, wow, it's kind of interesting. You kind of went real far in assigning yourself railroading when the actual adventure actually is very, it's very dangerous. And yet there is a lot of strategizing available to you. You really have to kind of, really grapple with this. Mm. And it's very much up to the players. There's nothing the DM can do in terms of how the players choose to deal with this at all. It's up to them. So, so it's kind of interesting though, because it wasn't, I'm not sure I would call it a railroad. I would, however, call it an in and out dungeon. It was a solid crawl. You get in there, and treasure's one thing, but your ass is another. Can you get out? And and in that, remember, I don't use the crawl as a pejorative. The crawl is a tried and true way to play. And so it's just kind of interesting that if it's a crawl with lots and lots and lots of floatiness, like Bone Hill, then you call it naturalistic or wide open or sandboxy. If it's not, but is no less a crawl, you say it's a railroad.
Right.
So
railroad.
Well, that's an unusual use.
As ill-defined a word as
sandbox. It is. Although the notion of get in there and do it is implied. But personally, I usually use the word railroad much more in terms of moment-to-moment choices and their significance.
Right, and I think that's a great definition. I think a lot of people use it exactly as you were saying, which is you have to go here and you have to do the thing.
Right. With
the entire crawl or whatever it is.
Right, and so it's really an interesting thing. I find that's another example of purposes of play. Right, as a purpose of play issue. He's saying, well, I have a purpose of play, and I have something that works really, really well for that. Right. And that's how it is.
Right.
So there's some really interesting nuances, I guess, which really only show us that we are stomping around in a sea of highly emotional and marketing relevant terms.
Absolutely.
That will do nothing but get us into trouble if we rely on them for meaning.
Right, because as soon as a term is used either emotionally or marketing, let alone both, its meaning starts getting really wiggly and weak. And
the idea being that, therefore, if you want to do really functional play with any one of these products, you're going to have to make some decisions. You're going to have to make some decisions about whether their choices is really what you wanted to do. You can't just say, I'm a Sandbox player, so I'm going to do this. Everybody, thank you very, very much for coming to Kittybox. I think we had some good food for thought, a lot of chance for some good discussion to follow up. And I will... Any last words?
Nope, thanks for hosting. Had a great time.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. It was really interesting, really illuminating.
I hope so. All right.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.